Well, the big troop drawdown of NATO countries is actually happening. We talked about this over the last couple of months, that President Trump, being disappointed with the NATO allies, has also talked about withdrawing troops. And people saw the two things as part of the same exact headline, that the reason that Trump is pulling out the troops is because he's disappointed that so many of these NATO countries wouldn't help out with the Iran situation. But I pointed out that this is actually a much more well thought out and longstanding policy of the Trump administration. But let's take a look at what's actually happening now. This is a big story today. So here's the Washington Post. Pentagon says U.S. will cut thousands of troops from Europe. Poland was set to receive forces whose deployment was abruptly halted last week. This is from today. The Pentagon announced late Tuesday that it was pausing the deployment of any additional troops to NATO ally Poland as the Trump administration moves forward with its America First agenda and pulls thousands of forces from Europe. The pause is part of a reduction of U.S. forces in Europe from 4 brigade combat teams to 3 units that each include as many as 4,000 soldiers, tanks, and massive amounts of support gear. President Donald Trump has long pushed European countries to assume a bigger role in their collective defense, but in recent weeks, he has seethed at what he sees as a lack of support among core NATO allies for the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran. You see, they're tying it directly to the war in Iran. In a statement, the Pentagon called Poland a model U.S. ally and said that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had called Polish Deputy Prime Minister Kosiniak-Kamysz earlier in the day to assure him that the U.S. would retain a strong military presence in Poland despite the planned personnel reduction. The troop reduction has deeply concerned NATO allies as Russia continues its war in Ukraine and threatens the alliance's eastern flank. Okay. Anything else in here? Yeah. So we have some pushback from some of the less MAGA, I would say, members of Congress who don't like this. And there you go. All right, let's take a look at Vice President J.D. Vance yesterday. Here's what he had to say.
So last week, the Pentagon halted deployment of 4,000 troops, U.S. troops, to Poland. This is in direct contradiction to President Trump explicitly promised not to reduce the troop level in Poland. So I'm going to ask you this question. Which many people in Poland think. Why are you rewarding Putin and punishing your best ally in Europe?
Well, first of all, I'd say there's been no president who's done more, frankly, to ensure that Ukraine survived the invasion of Russia than Donald Trump. As he famously said, Obama gave him sheets, I gave him javelins, and it was those javelins that ensured that Ukraine still has its territorial sovereignty. What he's also said is that he wants to pursue an American policy that focused on the interests of the United States. And part of that foreign policy is not to reward Putin or not to punish a country like Poland, which we love. We love Poland. We love the Polish people. No. What we're trying to do, what our foreign policy is geared towards, is promoting European independence and sovereignty. We want Europe to take more ownership over its own territorial integrity. We want Europe to step up in a big way. Now, I think you said 4,000 troops. We've not reduced the troop levels in Poland by 4,000 troops. What we did is that we delayed a troop deployment that was going to go to Poland. That's not a reduction. That's just a standard delay and rotation that sometimes happens in these situations. But here's the fundamental problem. Poland is capable of defending itself with a lot of support from the United States. We're not talking about pulling every single American troop out of Europe. We're talking about shifting some resources around in a way that maximizes American security. I don't think that's bad for Europe. That's encouraging Europe to take more ownership. The United States cannot be the policeman of the world. We want to be good allies. We want to make sure that our troop presence promotes regional stability in Europe. The president has not said, though he could, the president has not said that he's taken all of the troops out of Europe, but Europe has to stand on its own 2 feet. And that's something that he's been consistent of, frankly, not even since the beginning of this administration, going back to the first administration, is we have got to have more sovereignty and more of Europe standing on its own 2 feet. That will continue to be our policy in Europe.
Those troops will go eventually to Poland?
What I said is that is it a delay in troop rotation? Those troops could go elsewhere in Europe. We could decide to send them elsewhere. We actually haven't made the final determination about where those troops are ultimately going to go. But what I'm saying is it is not accurate to say that we are pulling a bunch of troops out. It is a very small and very minor thing. And I think, frankly, a lot of the European media, again, is overreacting to this a bit. And here's one thing I'll say about this. Look, I have, for my entire life, I'm 41 years old. For my entire life, I have heard chirping from the European media about everything that's wrong with the United States of America. We don't have this. We don't have that. We don't spend enough on healthcare, even though part of the reason why we spend so much on defense was because we have tens of thousands of troops in Europe. I think that if the European media wants to attack the President of the United States, they need to start looking in the mirror. All he has said is that we're going to be good allies. We're going to be good friends. We're going to be trading partners, but it is reasonable for Europe to take a little bit more ownership over its continental integrity.
Support journalism.
There you go. So, I mean, the sense of entitlement is unbelievable from that, from that European journalist, from that Polish journalist. Like, you're punishing Poland and you're rewarding Putin. And as JD Vance made it very clear, whoa. You can defend yourself on your own. America will help. America's more than happy to help. America wants to help. But, it's just incredible. Just imagine if every U.S. ally, if every one of the NATO countries was like Israel, where we don't want your troops, we don't want your personnel, we don't want your men in harm's way on our behalf, but we do want your help. I mean, now Israel's even talking about drawing down the military aid to zero. But and this is where I've talked about this so many times, the whole aid discussion, Israel gets all this aid and, these NATO countries don't get aid. Yeah, they don't get aid. All they get is tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of troops all over Europe from the United States. What does that cost? That defense spending, defending these European nations. So it's just so ridiculous to, where people think of Israel as a drain on the US Treasury, but these NATO allies, are not. Whatever, that's just an Israel point. But here you see, this was excellent pushback by Vice President JD Vance. And also, I've pointed this out many times, the National Security Strategy document that was published by the Trump administration. That document was published months before the Iran war. This isn't about the Iran war. Here's the National Security Strategy document. And on page 29 of it, it says right here, promoting European greatness. And it speaks about everything going on in Europe. And it speaks about the lack of self-confidence in Europe. Should present trends continue, the continent will be unrecognizable in 20 years or less. As such, it is far from obvious whether certain European countries will have economies and militaries strong enough to remain reliable allies. We want Europe to remain European. This lack of self-confidence is most evident in Europe's relationship with Russia. European allies enjoy a significant hard power advantage over Russia by almost every measure, save nuclear weapons. As a result of Russia's war in Ukraine, European relations with Russia are now deeply attenuated, and many Europeans regard Russia as an existential threat. Managing European relations with Russia will require significant U.S. diplomatic engagement, both to reestablish conditions of strategic stability across Europe, the Eurasian landmass, and to mitigate the risk of conflict. So, in other words, the U.S. understands that it will be involved in these things, but our goal is to help Europe correct its current trajectory. We will need a strong Europe to help us successfully compete. Over the long term, it is more than plausible that within a few decades at the latest, certain NATO members will become majority non-European. As such, it is an open question whether they will view their place in the world or their alliance with the United States in the same way as those who signed the NATO Charter. That's talking about the Islamization of Europe. And the United States wants, they want strong allies. They want allies who can share in the burden, of their own defense. That's all they're looking for here. There's a section on that. There's a section on burden sharing. Here we go. Look at this. This is one of the key components of this document. Burden sharing and burden shifting. The days of the United States propping up the entire world order like Atlas are over. We count among our many allies and partners dozens of wealthy, sophisticated nations that must assume primary responsibility for their regions and contribute far more to our collective defense. President Trump has set a new global standard with the Hague Commitment. That's the commitment to which pledges NATO countries to spend 5% on GDP on defense, and which our NATO allies have endorsed and must now meet. Continuing President Trump's approach of asking allies to assume primary responsibility for their regions, the United States will organize a burden-sharing network with our government as convener and supporter. This approach ensures that burdens are shared. Right? The United States will stand ready to help, potentially through more favorable treatment on commercial matters, technology sharing, defense procurement, to those countries that willingly take more responsibility for security in their neighborhoods and align their export controls with ours. Right? That's the basics of it. And here is this gentleman you see on your screen here. His name is Alexis Grinkowicz. He's the American general. He serves as the commander of the United States European Command and Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. And he's held that position since last July. And he said, he said this in a press conference.
In accordance with President Trump's announcement, it'll be 5,000 troops coming out of Europe. As I mentioned in my opening comments, a fair number of those come from the Armored Brigade Combat Team that is returning. And the U.S. has also already announced that the previously planned deployment of a long-range fires battalion will be curtailed and will not start occurring. There's some other additional minor elements that will be shifting as well. The planning is still ongoing for what those are for another several hundred troops. And so we can talk about that a little bit later, but the total number is 5,000. On your question of, how does it impact us? Since the rotational brigade that is returning now without replacement showed up in 2022, a lot has happened in the alliance. First off, the Baltic allies and the Poles and many others have really built up their ground combat power.
There you have it. The Baltic allies, those countries that have stepped up, they've listened to what's in this document that I just shared with you, where it says in there that it talks about the Eastern European. It talks about the Eastern European allies, right in here. That, where is it? Building up the healthy nations of Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe through commercial ties, weapon sales, political collaboration, and cultural and educational exchanges. The United States is willing to help those countries that are willing to help themselves. And so he's attributing the troop drawdown partially to the fact that these European nations are actually stepping up more. Now, at the same press conference, NATO chief Mark Rutte spoke to this in this, and he took questions from the crowd, and you see the attitude of these European journalists about what this is about. They want to make this all about Trump being a bad guy. Look at how Rutte responds.
Secretary General Andrew Gray from Reuters.
Good morning.
Good morning. You have said that you have a no surprises agreement with President Trump in terms of the transition to a greater European role in NATO. But what we've seen over the last couple of weeks is repeated surprises over this announcement about a drawdown of US troops. First, it was meant to be coming from Germany. Now it's meant to be coming from Poland. Nobody's very clear about the numbers. Even the Polish government doesn't seem to know what's happening. And NATO itself said it was seeking to clarify with the US when it made the initial announcement. So doesn't this mean that it's not no surprises, it's turned into surprise central, and that undermines your deterrence?
I will answer your question, but let me first zone out for a few, not for a few minutes, I won't be that long, but let me first zone out and then I'll get to your question. What is happening at the moment, and this is taking place now since February last year, is that the Europeans and the Canadians are massively stepping up in terms of defense spending.
Okay, February of last year is the Hague Convention, where Trump got the commitment from the NATO allies to spend 5% of GDP on defense. That's what he's talking about there.
As I mentioned before, Germany will spend by 2029 over 150 billion euros. That's over $175 billion, twice as much as in 2021. We see this all over Europe. My country, the whole of the all the European allies, and Canada, the whole of the alliance on 2%, and including the bigger economies. So this is massively taking part at this moment happening. You heard the US Vice President yesterday. I totally agreed with him. Europe has to take a bigger role. Europe will take a bigger role together with Canada. A stronger Europe in a stronger NATO, taking more of the responsibility for the conventional defense. And yes, the US will stay involved in Europe. Also over time, of course, when it comes to nuclear, but also when it comes to the conventional. Against that background, we know that adjustments will take place. The US has to pivot more towards, for example, Asia. This will take place over time in a structured way. What you have clearly heard yesterday from the Supreme Allied Commander, from General Krinkovich, when it comes to this announcement, the 4,000, the 5,000, it is rotational forces, not having an impact on NATO's defense plans.
Okay.
Okay, so there's, sorry, I got it wrong. The Supreme Allied Commander, who I played the clip before, that was yesterday. That wasn't the same press conference, but it's the same event. It's this big NATO meeting that they're having. So you see there that Rutte is actually parroting, what Trump has been saying, that, listen, this is a good thing. More European involvement is better. We're moving from 2% to 5%. These countries are spending more money. They're taking more responsibility. This is all a very good thing. Now there's another question from the French press.
And second row here, AFP.
Thanks so much, Secretary General. Max Delaney, AFP. Just following up on this subject, you said structured, but this seems anything but structured. So how do you respond to this notion that this is punitive, impulsive from President Trump against Germany for speaking out against him? And then secondly, on a related note, the force model is expected to be agreed on by defense policy people on Friday. The US is widely expected in Europe to massively reduce the number of its forces. Do you expect them to reduce the number of forces available to SACA, and what message will this send over the US commitment to Europe?
Hey, the NATO force model and the US contribution to the NATO force model. This is a debate which started again a year ago. This is why Europe is spending so much more to basically end the over-reliance on one ally when it comes to defense of the totality of NATO territory. This is why European and Canadian allies are increasing their spending, increasing their capabilities, massively investing in the defense industrial base on both sides of the Atlantic. When it comes to the NATO force model, we have the processes in place. This is normal business. This was to be expected. I think it is only right that it happens. What exactly will be the announcement, you have to wait till later. I'm not allowed to disclose that. But I think this is exactly as we expected and absolutely within the realm of the no surprises approach.
There you go. You see the hostility of the media where he's saying that, oh, this is all, Trump lashing out. It's a temper tantrum. He's just punishing Germany. And there's some element to that. And Trump definitely wants to call them out and wants to show that the king has no clothes and that these NATO allies are actually impotent and need to step up. So Trump does use humiliation as a tactic of diplomacy. That is no doubt. But this is all a good thing. This is all very good. It's very healthy. And you see Rutte is really pushing back on this, on any negative spin that they're trying to put on Trump. And he's not the only one. Take a look at this article. U.S. leadership has made NATO stronger than ever, Minister of North Macedonia tells Euronews. This whole article about this, where he's praising what Trump is doing. And he's actually made, by forcing NATO to step up, pay more, take more responsibility. And of course, the threats and the humiliation are a part of that. That's part of the way Trump operates. But he's actually made NATO into a stronger alliance. Now, there's still the big question hovering over the whole thing, which I raised from the National Security Strategy document, which is, what about the Islamization of Europe? What's going to happen to these European countries? If they start producing more troops of their own, let's say, who are those troops? Who are those people? Who's serving in those militaries? Are all these massive young Muslims? Like, the younger population in these European countries skews more towards the children of the immigrant populations. Are we going to start seeing European armies that are heavily populated by Muslims, or are the armies still going to be made up of the older European natives. Should be interesting to see. But either way, this is the stronger NATO, a stronger NATO as a result of Trump's policies. So it's really a win-win in the long term. And Trump is, his approach to everything is there's no reason to just keep existing problematic, dysfunctional systems going just because they've been there a long time. It's the same approach to the Iranian regime. Everyone else kicks the can down the road for 47 years, and then it feels like, oh, that's just the way it is. You got to live with it. No, you don't. You can change things. And Trump takes that approach to so many different aspects of policy, and thank God that he does. So yeah, there you have it. That's my report on what is going on with the NATO alliance and with this whole troop drawdown. We're seeing it happen. Trump said he was going to do it, and very quickly we now see it happening. I think we're going to see more of this. If it stays here and it's just a drawdown of 5,000 troops and that's the end of it, then it's not very much. That's a tiny percentage of the U.S. footprint in Europe. So we'll have to see what the next steps are. We're going to be watching this closely. Thanks for watching. God bless.